The midday sun over Luzon burned white and heavy, turning the steel of every hangar into a mirror. The war was winding down, but for Major Frank T. McCoy of the Technical Air Intelligence Unit, the real work had just begun. His job was to understand the enemy, piece by piece, bolt by bolt. That morning, he and two mechanics stepped onto the cracked tarmac of Clark Air Base. All around lay wreckage, twisted propellers, torn fuselages, blackened scraps of planes that once terrorized the Pacific. Yet what caught his attention wasn't wreckage at all, it was perfection. At the far end of the field stood a Japanese bomber, complete, untouched, almost gleaming. Its paint, faded green with the rising sun insignia, shimmered under the tropical haze. The tail read 763-12, the type, Mitsubishi G4M, Navy Type 1 attack bomber. The Allies called it Betty. McCoy lowered his binoculars. "It's intact," he whispered, "completely intact." He'd seen captured aircraft before, crashed Zeros, shattered Nates, even pieces of Vals, but never something like this. This was no carcass salvaged from jungle mud. This was a living ghost. As he approached, he noticed the strange, slender shape, a long cylindrical body like a cigar on tricycle landing gear. Every line looked deliberate, elegant, aerodynamic, almost beautiful, but beauty in war often hides horror. The first clue. McCoy climbed the boarding ladder, camera slung around his neck. The cockpit smelled of stale fuel and sea air. Instruments were intact. The radios worked. Even the charts were still tucked behind the navigator's seat. Whoever flew this machine had left in a hurry. He began a standard inspection, nose to tail, every panel opened, every cable photographed. The wings drew his curiosity. Their curve seemed impossibly thin. He unfastened an inspection plate and peered inside. Then he froze. Behind the plate lay the bomber's heart, its fuel tanks. Great shimmering bladders of aluminum, polished smooth, filled the space between spars. They were naked, no rubber compound, no armor plates, no fireproof coating, just thin sheets of metal, 2 millimeters thick, holding thousands of liters of aviation fuel. McCoy blinked twice, leaned closer, and tapped the tank with a screwdriver. The sound was hollow, fragile, like tapping a beer can. "This can't be right," one mechanic murmured. "It's right," McCoy said softly, "and that's the terrifying part. The photograph." He raised his camera and took a picture, the first of hundreds that day. The flashbulb burst against the gleaming wing. In that instant, the truth of Japan's bomber philosophy burned onto film. The Betty wasn't just another aircraft, it was evidence of an entirely different idea of war. The Americans had always built to protect the crew. Armor, redundancy, self-sealing fuel tanks. Every extra pound was justified if it brought men home. But here stood a bomber built as if human lives weighed nothing at all. Later, in his report, McCoy would write, "Fuel tanks completely unprotected. No self-sealing compound, no armor plating, no fire suppression system, entire airframe designed for range at the expense of survival." He didn't know it yet, but the data he collected that week would change Allied doctrine, shaping not only how the US fought the rest of the Pacific War, but how it would design bombers for generations. The puzzle of performance. To understand the insanity of the design, McCoy gathered his team that evening in a small briefing hut at the edge of the base. On the table lay sketches of the G4M structure, weight charts and fuel capacity estimates scribbled in pencil. "Gentlemen," he began, "this aircraft can carry nearly 5,000 liters of fuel. That's about 4 tons. With full tanks, she could fly over 3,700 miles farther than any bomber in service, even ours." The mechanics exchanged looks of disbelief. "But to do it," McCoy continued, "they've stripped her bare. No armor, no self-sealing tanks. The aluminum in those wings is thinner than a coin." A silence fell. One technician finally said what everyone was thinking, "So one hit and she's gone." McCoy nodded. "Exactly. They built her to reach targets no one else could reach, and in doing so they made her a flying torch." Flashback. The first time she struck. McCoy's analysis carried him backward through the war, to the day the Betty first revealed herself to the world, December 8, 1941. While smoke still drifted over Pearl Harbor, 82 G4Ms and 26 G3Ms lifted off from Formosa, bound for the Philippines. Their target, Clark Field, the same base where McCoy now stood. At 12:35 p.m. the sky darkened. The formation glided in at 20,000 feet, just out of reach of American guns. Then came the bombs, 636 in total, falling in silver arcs. Moments later, Zero fighters screamed in at treetop height, guns blazing. In 45 minutes, American air power in the Philippines ceased to exist. 17 B-17 flying fortresses had been parked on the ground that morning. 12 were gone by afternoon. The rest lay in flames. Lieutenant James Harrington, one of the few who survived, later wrote, "They came in perfect formation, high, untouchable, and when the fighters dove, they tore us apart. We never even got a plane airborne. Back then, nobody knew what kind of bombers they were, but every survivor remembered one thing: their speed, their altitude, and the precision of their attack. The Betty had announced itself in fire the day the battleships died. 2 days later, the same bomber changed the course of naval warfare forever. December 10, 1941, the South China Sea. A Japanese strike force of Bettys and older Nells sighted Force Z, the British battleship Prince of Wales, and the battlecruiser Repulse. 26 G4Ms dove through the clouds. Each carried a single Type 91 torpedo, 840 kilograms of steel and high explosive, specially designed for shallow water. The torpedo crews practiced endlessly for this moment. At 12:20 p.m. the first wave released. Sleek silver fish raced across the water, white wakes slicing toward their targets. Repulse tried to maneuver, guns hammering, but the torpedoes found her anyway. 1, 2, 3, 4 impacts. The hull shuddered, the deck buckled. Prince of Wales, the pride of the Royal Navy, took 6 hits. Damage control failed. She listed heavily, rolled, and sank at 1:20 p.m. Repulse followed 13 minutes later. 841 sailors went down with them. In less than 2 hours, Japan had accomplished what naval theorists once deemed impossible, sinking capital ships in open sea using aircraft alone, and leading the strike was the Betty, the Empire's reach. From that moment, the bomber became the embodiment of Japan's expansion. Its range made the Pacific feel small. It hit Darwin in Australia, 1,500 miles away. It struck Port Moresby, crossed the jungled mountains of New Guinea, and attacked Guadalcanal from Rabaul, 600 miles of open ocean. To Allied soldiers, it seemed like the Japanese could appear anywhere, anytime. To the Japanese Navy, the Betty was proof of technological mastery, a weapon that could project power beyond imagination. But the truth, as McCoy now understood while tracing his fingers along its unarmored wings, was that every mile of that range was bought with blood, a philosophy written in metal. By candlelight in the intelligence hut, McCoy wrote his conclusion. The G4M is a paradox, brilliant engineering dedicated to a fatal idea. It achieves what no bomber should be able to do, but only by discarding every safeguard that makes flight survivable. He imagined the man who had designed it, somewhere in Nagoya, years earlier, running the same calculations he was now running in reverse. How much does armor weigh? How much fuel is lost because of it? How many miles does each kilogram of protection cost? And somewhere, a pencil must have stopped, a decision made. Remove the armor. The numbers had won. The ghost of Formosa. McCoy's team unearthed Japanese documents that confirmed it. The Navy's 1937 requirements demanded a bomber with a range of 4,700 kilometers, enough to strike from Formosa to Manila and back, or from the home islands deep into the Pacific. No other country dared demand such extremes. To achieve it, Mitsubishi's chief designer, Kiro Honjo, had sacrificed everything else. He built an aircraft that could outrun fighters of its day and reach targets no one else could dream of, but one that would ignite at the first hit. Honjo's colleagues admired him, his government decorated him, and his crews, they burned for his mathematics. Foreshadowing the fall, standing beside the captured bomber, McCoy couldn't yet see the whole story, but the clues were all here: the gleaming fuel tanks, the lack of armor, the equations carved into every line of the plane's body. He photographed every inch, documented every anomaly, knowing that somewhere in these details lay the logic of a tragedy. In a few weeks his report would reach Washington, London, and Sydney. Commanders would finally understand why Japanese bombers exploded so easily, why Allied pilots called them flying Zippos, but they would also learn how that same design philosophy had allowed Japan to strike across half the world before the tide turned. For now, McCoy simply stared at the silent machine, its nose pointed east, as if it still longed to fly home. The war was almost over, but the Betty's story, its rise, its triumphs, and its terrible cost was only beginning to be understood. When the smoke cleared over the Philippines and the South China Sea, Allied commanders finally grasped the nightmare. Japan's new land-based bomber could reach farther than any plane they possessed. It wasn't bound by carriers or by coastlines. It was the first truly strategic aircraft in the Pacific. From Formosa to the Dutch East Indies, from Saigon to Rabaul, the Mitsubishi G4M Betty became the Empire's spear. Wherever Japan advanced, the Betty's shadow arrived first. The year of the rising sun. In the first 6 months of 1942, Japan appeared unstoppable. The United States was reeling, the British Empire was retreating, the Dutch colonies were collapsing, and at the center of each campaign, somewhere above the horizon, the Betty's twin engines droned like the heartbeat of victory. She struck the oil refineries at Balikpapan, igniting the night sky in sheets of flame. She hammered Singapore's docks until the sea turned black with smoke. She chased retreating convoys across the Java Sea and hunted Allied warships through the Malayan Straits. Each new victory expanded the map and stretched Japan's reach farther. The bomber had become a strategic illusion. Speed mistaken for invincibility, range mistaken for immortality. Inside the beast, pilots who first flew the G4M were awed by its elegance. The controls were light, responsive. The sightlines were clear. For a bomber it handled almost like a fighter. In the cockpit, instruments gleamed in ordered precision. Japanese craftsmanship at its peak, with its twin Mitsubishi G4M 14-cylinder engines generating 1,500 horsepower apiece. The plane could cruise at 230 miles per hour and dash beyond 2060. The crew of 7 moved through a narrow, tubular fuselage no wider than a hallway. The navigator crouched behind the pilots. The bombardier lay prone in the glass nose. Gunners guarded their blistered stations with 7.7mm Type 92 machine guns. There was no armor plate, just thin metal between man and sky. But for the first half of 1942, none of that seemed to matter. The Betty could go where no enemy fighter could follow, and so the Imperial Navy used it recklessly. Darwin, the day Australia burned, February 19, 1942. The sun rose over northern Australia, calm and indifferent. At 10 a.m. sirens wailed in the coastal town of Darwin, but too late. 18 Japanese aircraft filled the sky. Among them were 27 G4M Bettys from the 1st Air Group, their bomb bays loaded with 500-kilogram explosives. They had flown 1,500 miles from Kendari, a range thought impossible for bombers. At 10:58, the first bomb struck the harbour. Oil tanks exploded. Ships erupted in gouts of orange flame. By 11 a.m. Darwin's port was an inferno. 8 ships sank outright, including the destroyer USS Peary. Australia had suffered the first air raid on its soil, and the Betty had proved it could reach any target across half an ocean. To the world it was another Japanese victory. To the engineers back at Mitsubishi, it was vindication. Every pound of armour they had sacrificed translated into this reach. By April 1942, the Betty was a familiar terror to the Allied troops holding Port Moresby. They would hear the faint buzz above the jungle canopy, look up and see nothing but sunlight, and then the bombs would fall. The aircraft flew from Rabaul 600 miles away, across mountain ridges that claimed pilots by the dozen. Even in rough weather, even when engines sputtered in tropical heat, the G4M kept coming, but cracks were forming, literal and figurative. The thin aluminum skin that gave the plane its sleek speed was prone to warping under stress. Fuel leaks were frequent. A burst hydraulic line could drench the bomb bay with gasoline vapors. Ground crews nicknamed it Hamaki, the cigar. Allied pilots twisted that into the flying cigarette. No one yet realized how prophetic that joke was. The turning point, Midway and the first losses. June 1942. The Battle of Midway. While carriers decided the fate of Japan's navy, Betty crews flew long-range patrols from Wake Island, searching desperately for an enemy fleet already bearing down on them. The crews saw the aftermath, flaming carriers, black columns of smoke, 4 Japanese carriers lost in a single day. The Empire's momentum cracked. With the Navy crippled, Japan leaned harder than ever on its land-based bombers. And so, as American counter-offensives began to rise, the Bettys were thrown into missions no aircraft so fragile should have flown. Guadalcanal, flying Zippos, August 1942. Marines seized Guadalcanal, building Henderson Field, a base that would change the war. From that moment, the Betty's luck ran out. On August 8, 23 G4Ms took off from Rabaul under orders to crush the new airstrip. American fighters, F-4F Wildcats, and newly arrived P-400s, intercepted the formation near Savo Island. In minutes, the sky was chaos. Tracer lines, smoke trails, explosions so bright they left after images. 5 limped home, riddled and leaking fire. One pilot barely made Rabaul's runway before his wing tank exploded, killing the ground crew that ran to help. It was the worst single-day loss the Type 1 had ever suffered, and it would not be the last. Survivors described the nightmare vividly. Tracer rounds from American fighters sliced through the wings like knives through paper. A few hits to the center section where 4 of the plane's 8 fuel tanks were clustered, and the bomber became a torch. Gunners burned at their stations before they could unbuckle. Smoke filled the cockpit. Flames raced along the fuselage faster than men could crawl. Parachutes ignited as crews tried to escape. One pilot, Lieutenant Kenji Hamada, would later write from a hospital cot in Rabaul, "We carried the ocean inside our wings. Once it caught fire, there was nothing to do but pray." The plane became a sun. Within weeks, Allied pilots coined grim nicknames: Flying Cigar, One Shot Lighter, Flying Zippo. To be spotted in a Betty formation was, for an American fighter, an opportunity to score an easy kill. To be inside a Betty formation was, for its crew, a sentence. From August to October 1942, more than 100 Bettys were lost around Guadalcanal alone. Nearly 700 Japanese aviators died in those 3 months. The math was horrifying. For every mission that left Rabaul, at least half the planes failed to return. And yet the orders never changed. The Empire demanded range. The engineers had given them range, and the crews were expected to die maintaining it. Back at Clark Field, months after his discovery, Major McCoy's detailed technical report reached Allied headquarters. Engineers read his description of unprotected fuel tanks with disbelief. No Western nation would accept such a compromise, not when self-sealing technology was standard on even light fighters. The findings circulated quickly. Generals began to understand why their pilots reported Bettys erupting like firecrackers. Training manuals were updated. Aim for the wings, 2 bursts are enough. The enemy's secret weapon had become its greatest vulnerability. Allied aeronautical engineers ran the numbers. Each self-sealing fuel cell on a B-17 added 180 pounds but reduced fire risk by 70%. That half-ton had bought 400 extra miles of range, but it had cost thousands of lives. The conclusion was brutal but undeniable. The Betty was perfectly engineered for a war Japan could not afford to fight, a short, surprise-driven conflict where speed mattered more than survival. In the long war that unfolded instead, it became an execution chamber with wings, the human face of attrition. As 1942 dragged into 1943, the Betty crews felt the noose tightening. Mechanics at Rabaul nicknamed the airfield the crematorium. Young pilots toasted each other with rice wine before missions, joking that they were already ghosts. One diary recovered after the war contained a single haunting line: "We fly until we burn. There is nothing else." For many, even that fatalism became a source of pride. The Bushido Code taught that sacrifice for the emperor was the highest honor. In the Betty, that philosophy had found its purest and most terrible expression. Commanders tried everything: night attacks, low-level torpedo runs, even missions through thunderstorms to mask approach. Nothing helped. The thin skin of the G4M shredded in bad weather. Rain leaked through seams. Lightning shorted its radios. Each adjustment created new problems. By early 1943, attrition was so severe that Japanese designers rushed a stopgap fix. 30mm rubber sheets were glued beneath the wings to slow leaks from bullet holes. It wasn't true self-sealing, it was a bandage on a mortal wound. The mod slightly reduced range and speed. It didn't reduce funerals. As new American fighters arrived, Hellcats, Corsairs, P-38 Lightnings, the balance shattered completely. The Betty could no longer escape interception. Over Solomon Islands, Lieutenant Commander John Blackburn of VF-17 recalled his first encounter. "We hit them just once in the wing, and they lit up like a match. You didn't need to waste ammo, just a quick burst and they were gone." The same bomber that had terrified Allied fleets in 1941 was now considered the easiest target in the Pacific. The once glorious symbol of Japanese air power had become a burning spectacle over every battlefield. Back in Tokyo, the Navy's Air Bureau refused to admit failure. They insisted that the Betty's range still gave Japan strategic value. More bombers were ordered, more crews trained, more fuel diverted from dwindling reserves. Factories at Nagoya produced as many as 100 aircraft a month through 1943, each one destined to die within weeks of delivery. Japan's industrial miracle had turned cannibal, feeding itself to the fire. In the Imperial War College, senior officers debated whether to redesign the plane entirely or to replace it, but there was no time, no materials, and no alternative ready for production. The Navy had built its strategy around the G4M's reach. Without it, Japan's island network would suffocate, and so they kept building a plane that everyone knew could not survive. By December 1942, the myth of invincibility was dead. The Betty had given Japan its victories, but also its grief. Its story mirrored the empire itself, breathtaking in ambition, brilliant in conception, doomed by arrogance. For the crews who still climbed aboard each dawn, there was only one comfort: that their sacrifice might hold the line a little longer. They would take off knowing the odds, reciting silent prayers as the engines roared to life. Some didn't even bother with parachutes. They said there was no point. Night over Rabaul. The last bomber of the day taxis toward the runway, its navigation lights winking like candles in the dark. Mechanics salute. The engines rise to a scream. The plane lifts, vanishing into the black Pacific sky. Down below, a single officer watches until the sound fades, then turns to a comrade. "Do you think they'll make it back?" His friend shakes his head. No one does. The camera lingers on the empty runway, shimmering in the tropical heat. The nights over Rabaul had grown darker, the air heavier. The jungle around the airfield pulsed with the hum of insects and the faint, restless clatter of mechanics working by lantern light. Rows of Mitsubishi G4Ms lined the taxiways, sleek silver-green glinting faintly beneath the stars. From a distance, they looked like a fleet of metallic ghosts waiting to take flight. Up close, their beauty was deceptive. To every pilot who climbed those ladders, each fuselage represented both duty and death. By now, the pilots no longer joked about the flying lighter, they accepted it as fact. Lieutenant Masaru Tomita, 22 years old, wrote in his journal, "They told us the Betty was fast enough to outrun death, but the Americans are faster now, so we fly slower and die quicker." Desperation and denial. By 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy could feel the momentum of the war slipping away. The Betty had once been the sharp edge of conquest, now it was the only blade left, and it was blunted by loss. Every week reports came in from airfields across the Pacific, Guadalcanal, New Britain, the Solomons. Every week more crews were lost. The engineers at Mitsubishi scrambled to find solutions. Their orders were impossible: increase survivability without losing range. At the Nagoya Design Bureau, Kira Honjo, the man who had conceived the Betty 6 years earlier, studied charts of loss rates and field reports that read like eulogies. He had once been celebrated for building a machine of elegance and reach. Now he was being asked to make it less deadly to its own men. Honjo tried every compromise imaginable. He thickened the skin in key areas. He experimented with rubber lining beneath fuel cells. He proposed smaller auxiliary tanks to reduce flammable volume. Each improvement shaved a few kilometers off range, a few knots off speed, and was met with resistance from the Navy. The Admiralty's demands never changed. The bomber must fly 3,700 kilometers with a full payload. In Tokyo, range was still king. In the skies over the Solomon Islands, it was a death sentence. The Australians find the proof. In November 1942, Australian forces advancing along the Papuan coast captured Boona Airfield and stumbled across half a dozen Bettys, some damaged, others merely abandoned in retreat. For Allied engineers, it was like uncovering a Rosetta Stone of Japanese aviation. They opened panels, traced wiring, and found precisely what McCoy had found months earlier at Clark Field: unprotected fuel systems, thin aluminum tanks, no sealant, no foam, no fire suppression. Every discovery confirmed the same terrifying logic. It wasn't in neglect, it was intent. The reports circulated among the Allied intelligence community. The conclusion was unavoidable. Japan's bombers were designed to prioritize mission range at all costs. Their crews were expendable. In Washington, one analyst wrote, "Their airframes are masterful. Their philosophy is medieval. Fire in the sky, the turning of the tide." As 1943 dawned, the Betty's glory had turned to ash. Over the Solomons, American fighter strength multiplied. The skies above Bougainville and New Georgia swarmed with P-38s, P-40s, Corsairs and Hellcats. For Betty formations, the trip to target and back became a ritual of annihilation. They still launched in tight, precise formations, old habits that once symbolized discipline, but now made them perfect targets. Every tracer round that found a wing ignited the bomber's death. The men knew it, yet they flew anyway. A Japanese radio operator later recalled hearing the screams of burning airmen through open channels. You could hear the engines, then someone coughing from smoke, then silence. We never turned off the set. We listened until they were gone. The sky itself had become a crematorium. The death of Yamamoto. April 18, 1943. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the most respected officer in the Japanese Navy, planned an inspection tour of the front lines at Bougainville. He would travel aboard 2 G4M Betty bombers, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. His itinerary, encoded and transmitted, was intercepted by American intelligence. The U.S. Navy's cryptographers had cracked the Japanese code. The Americans planned an ambush that would become legend. The mission Operation Vengeance. At dawn on April 18, 16 P-38, Lightning fighters from the 339th Squadron lifted off from Guadalcanal. The pilots flew low, barely 50 feet above the ocean, across 400 miles of open water, maintaining radio silence. Their navigation relied on dead reckoning and courage. They would have one chance, 1 minute, one strike. At exactly 9:34 a.m., over the jungles of Bougainville, they saw 2 Betty bombers and 6 Zero escorts glittering in the sun. Captain Thomas Lamphere and Lieutenant Rex Barber dove from the clouds. Machine gun fire erupted. Barber's rounds tore through the first bomber's right wing, directly into the fuel tanks. In an instant, the plane became a fireball. It disintegrated in mid-air, scattering debris across the jungle. Admiral Yamamoto's body was found hours later, still seated, hand on his ceremonial sword. The second Betty tried to flee but met the same fate. Flames engulfed it before it struck the trees. No one survived. The meaning of his death. Yamamoto's assassination shook Japan like an earthquake. The nation's most brilliant strategist had died inside the very machine that embodied his empire's ideals. speed over safety, range over resilience, honor over life. In Tokyo, the news was censored. Publicly, the admiral had died in duty. Privately, the Navy knew the truth. His death was the consequence of engineering arrogance. The same unprotected fuel tanks that had given Japan its first victories had now consumed its greatest commander. The attempt to reinvent Yamamoto's death forced the Navy to confront reality. They ordered a comprehensive redesign of the Betty, one that could survive more than a single burst of enemy fire. Honjo and his team went back to the drawing board, producing the G4M Model 3, known internally as Model 34. This version finally included true self-sealing fuel tanks, rubberized cells that swelled when punctured, but nothing in war comes free. To fit the new tanks, fuel capacity had to be reduced from 6,490 litres to 4,490, range dropped by over 2,000 kilometres, speed decreased by 15 miles per hour. On paper it was a safer aircraft. In the air it was already obsolete. By then it didn't matter. When the Model 3 entered production in October 1944, the Pacific had changed beyond recognition. The US Navy ruled the seas. The skies belonged to Hellcats and Mustangs. Radar warning networks spotted raids before they reached their targets. Even a perfect bomber could not have survived such conditions, let alone a compromised one. Only 60 to 90 Model 3s were ever built before the war ended. Each was too little, too late. Rabaul, the fortress of fire. Throughout 1943, Rabaul remained Japan's aerial stronghold. Its airfields hummed day and night, Ohka, Lakunai, Tolbera, all launching wave after wave of Bettys into the teeth of American air power. For the crews, life had narrowed to routine and fear. Wake at dawn, eat cold rice, check fuel, light a cigarette, climb aboard. They joked about the cigarettes. They said it didn't matter if the match burned the paper, the plane would burn next anyway. Mechanics painted calligraphy on the fuselages. 7 lives for the Emperor, death before surrender. Every bomber was a shrine of defiance. Yet the attrition continued. Allied bombers struck Rabaul repeatedly, reducing hangars to rubble, fuel depots to molten lakes. By early 1944, Rabaul was cut off, isolated, its defenders still flying missions no one expected them to return from. One surviving Japanese ground officer later said, "Every takeoff was a funeral, every landing, a miracle." The weight of belief. By mid-1944, Japan's war planners faced the inevitable truth. The Betty could no longer reach its targets, and even if it could not survive. But still, they refused to give up on it. In their eyes, the bomber had become more than a machine. It was a symbol of endurance, of the Empire's will to fight on even as everything crumbled. And so, the Betty was repurposed one final time, not as a bomber, but as a vessel for sacrifice. Birth of the Ohka. At Kanoya Air Base in southern Japan, engineers unveiled a desperate innovation, the MXY-7 Ohka, or Cherry Blossom. It was a manned rocket-powered bomb, a suicide weapon designed to dive directly into enemy ships at over 600 miles per hour. But the Ohka could not take off on its own. It had to be carried within range by a Betty. This was the ultimate irony. A bomber already infamous for exploding under fire would now carry explosive pilots. The Betty's final mission was to deliver death and inevitably share it. First blood, the Ohka mission, March 21, 1945. 18 G4M Bettys of the 721st Kokutai took off from Kanoya, each carrying one Ohka beneath its belly. Their objective, the US invasion fleet off Okinawa, 400 kilometers away. American radar spotted them long before they arrived. Burdened by the massive rockets slung beneath them, the Bettys could barely maneuver. They were flying targets. One by one they ignited mid-air, raining flaming debris and human remains into the sea. Not a single Ohka reached its target. 137 bomber crewmen and 15 Ohka pilots died within 30 minutes. The mission's codename was Thunder Gods. In the end, the thunder only burned themselves. The philosophy of death. By now, Japanese aviation had crossed from strategy into ritual. The Betty's final iterations were not designed for victory. They were designed for martyrdom. The logic of range and performance had been replaced by a theology of sacrifice. In the closing months of the war, hundreds of Bettys were converted into training ships, transports, and suicide carriers. Few survived to see 1945's end. Those that did were stripped of weapons, painted white with green crosses, the color of surrender. The White Betty. August 19th, 4 days after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, 2 G4M Betty bombers repainted pure white with green cross insignia took off from Atsugi Airfield. Call signs Bataan 1 and Bataan 2. On board were Japan's envoys flying to Iijima to meet American officers and negotiate the terms of surrender. The name Bataan was deliberate, an echo of the humiliation Japan had once inflicted on the United States. Now the roles were reversed. Escorted by American P-38s, The two Bettys flew silently over the same waters their ancestors had bombed 4 years earlier. When they landed, US soldiers watched with a mix of awe and disbelief. The planes were unmistakable, long cylindrical fuselages, once symbols of terror, now painted with peace. The circle was complete. The same aircraft that had opened the war at Clark Field in 1941 now carried Japan's surrender delegation in 1945. The war was over. The wreckage of empires baked under the Philippine sun. Major Frank T. McCoy stood once again beside the same bomber he had discovered months earlier, tail number 76312, now stripped of its propellers, its paint dull and peeling. The air was silent except for wind whispering through the hollow fuselage. McCoy had come to finish what he started, the last inspection, the last photograph, the last entry in his notebook. He knelt by the wing, ran his hand across the metal, and felt the same disbelief he'd felt that first day. 2 millimeters of aluminum, that was all that separated life from explosion. He wrote one final line: "They built brilliance and buried humanity inside it." The war's arithmetic, the figures told a story of annihilation. Of the roughly 2,414 Bettys built between 1941 and 1945, fewer than 60 remained airworthy when Japan surrendered. Over 90% were destroyed in combat, burned, exploded, or ditched at sea. Crew survival rates were the lowest of any major aircraft of the war. For every 100 airmen who took off in a G4M, barely a dozen lived to see 1945. Many died not because they failed, but because they succeeded in flying exactly the plane they were given. In the cold language of logistics, Japan had manufactured a masterpiece of efficiency. In the warmer language of humanity, it had manufactured a tragedy. Allied post-war analysis. After the surrender, teams of Allied engineers combed through captured factories' blueprints and crash sites. At Nagoya, they found the original engineering drawings, each line drawn with impeccable precision. Fuel systems, weight distribution charts, stress diagrams. They realized that nothing about the Betty was accidental. Every risk, every vulnerability, every omission had been mathematically justified. American engineer Harold Ross, part of the Technical Air Intelligence Unit, summed it up. The Betty wasn't bad engineering, it was engineering for a world that didn't exist. In 1937, when the G4M was conceived, the idea of long-range interception seemed fantastical. No one believed fighters could roam 500 miles from base. By 1942, radar, drop tanks, and superchargers had made it routine. Technology had outrun the assumptions of its own creators. Japan's mirror. In Tokyo, surviving officers of the Imperial Navy were summoned to testify before American intelligence boards. They spoke with quiet pride and visible exhaustion. Vice Admiral Kusaka Ryunosuke said, "Our bombers gave us empire, they also took it away. We flew too far into the future and left protection behind." The Japanese engineers were not fools, they were visionaries trapped inside doctrine. When the Navy demanded impossible range, they obeyed. When pilots burned alive, they refined fuel lines to make the fire spread slower, never thinking to question the order that caused it. The system rewarded obedience, not innovation. The Betty was its purest expression. The Americans compare to Allied scientists. The Betty became a case study in contrasting philosophies. The B-17 Flying Fortress was heavy, slow to build, and labor-intensive, but it brought its men home. Its self-sealing tanks added half a ton of weight but cut fire deaths by 3/4. Its armored bulkheads and compartmentalized design let damaged planes limp back to base on one engine. The Betty offered none of that. It traded armor for reach and gained nothing once the enemy caught up. The comparison was not just technical, it was philosophical. The United States viewed trained aircrews as irreplaceable resources. Japan viewed them as honor-bound tools of the emperor. Both sides built machines that reflected their values. The moral equation. When the smoke cleared, the Betty left behind a question that went beyond engineering. How much is performance worth when it costs human life? In post-war Japan, that question haunted the nation's engineers. The same men who had once drawn fuel tanks and wing spars for bombers were now redesigning buses, ships, and commercial airliners. Every line they drew carried memory of what those lines had once meant. Kiro Honjo himself testified during the Allied occupation's technical interviews. When asked if he regretted his design, he paused for a long moment. "A designer is told a goal," he said. "We achieved ours, but a goal without wisdom is a trap. The Betty was our trap." That sentence would become famous in Japan's engineering schools for decades to come. It was not a defense, it was a confession. The ghosts of the Pacific. Throughout the islands, wrecks of G4Ms remained where they had fallen, on reefs, in jungles, half submerged in swamps. American salvage teams found fuselages so intact that the metal still gleamed after years in salt water. Inside many were scorched parachutes still rolled tight, unopened. In one wreck on New Britain, a US Marine photographer found a pilot's diary, its pages fused together by heat. The last line, barely legible, read, "If we burn for the Emperor. If we live, we are ashamed." It was the perfect epitaph for the Betty bomber, a machine built on faith that courage could replace protection, the culture of silence. In the years after the war, survivors rarely spoke. Japan's society was too scarred, too busy rebuilding. The pilots who lived carried their memories quietly. Some became farmers, some became engineers in the new Mitsubishi Corporation, which shifted from weapons to automobiles. When asked about their wartime work, they used a phrase that had no exact translation. It was inevitable. They did not say wrong. They did not say necessary, only inevitable, like a storm no one could stop. But for the families of the thousands of airmen who never returned, the question remained, who was responsible? Was it the engineers who followed orders, the officers who gave them, or the culture that taught them death was the highest duty? The cold lessons of engineering. In 1946, US Air Force schools added a new case study to their curriculum, the Mitsubishi G4M and the doctrine of design compromise. Students were shown two models, one Betty, one B-25 Mitchell, same mission profile, similar size, opposite outcomes. The lesson was simple: a machine that ignores its environment will perish in it. That lesson would shape the jet age. Every modern aircraft from the B-52 to the 747 bears the shadow of the Betty's mistakes. Redundant fuel lines, fire suppression foam, titanium baffles between tanks, crew escape routes, all born from the memory of a plane that had none of them. Reconstruction and redemption. By the 1950s, Japan's industry had been transformed. Mitsubishi, once a war machine, was now building civilian vehicles and commercial aircraft parts. In 1955, Honjo himself visited a new assembly line for passenger planes. The workers asked him what had changed most since the old days. He looked at a row of fuel tanks wrapped in safety foam and said quietly, "Now we build to bring people home." The Betty had become a moral compass. Its failure was so total, so human, that it forced an entire generation of engineers to redefine what progress meant. The surrender flight remembered. Every August, on the anniversary of Japan's surrender, a small ceremony is held at Iijima Airfield. Historians and pilots gather to remember the two white Bettys, Betty N1 and Betty N2, that carried Japan's envoys to meet the Allies. Elderly villagers still recall seeing them descend through the clouds, painted pure white with green crosses of peace. Children had run to the fence line, expecting bombs. Instead, they saw a flag of surrender. One American escort pilot later wrote in his memoir, "It was the strangest sight of the war. Those long, beautiful bombers that had once burned our ships were now angels of peace." For the first time, the Betty did not kill anyone. That moment closed a circle 4 years in the making. The aircraft that had opened the Pacific War with flame had ended it in white, the film reels of memory. In the 1960s, Japanese documentarians searched for surviving Bettys to feature in war films. They found almost none. A few rusting frames in Palau, one half-intact fuselage in Borneo, another in Okinawa used as a chicken coop. Each was a ghost of a ghost. When filmmakers asked veterans to stand beside the wrecks, many refused. They would bow, say a prayer for the dead, and walk away. One former crewman simply said, "We do not need monuments. The Pacific is our monument." A designer's reflection. In his later years, Kiro Honjo granted one final interview to a university journal. He sat in a small office lined with blueprints and photographs of aircraft spanning decades of aviation. When asked what the Betty meant to him now, he smiled sadly. "The Betty was my youth. It was Japan's youth. We were told that speed and sacrifice were the same thing. They are not. A plane is a promise to return. If it cannot keep that promise, it is not a plane, it is a weapon against its own people." Those words became the final line of his obituary when he died in 1963. Legacy in the jet age. As aviation advanced into jets, the Betty story remained a touchstone in flight safety philosophy. American and Japanese engineers collaborated during the 1950s to create international standards for crew protection and fuel system redundancy. Every checklist, every training manual that speaks of fire containment zones owes its existence to those thin, unprotected wings found at Clark Field. In museums around the world, the Betty is often displayed beside a B-17 or a B-24, not to compare strength but to show contrast. Two philosophies of war. One built to preserve, the other built to perish. Both changed history. Ethical aftershock. Beyond engineering, the Betty posed a deeper moral question. How does a nation teach its people to value life after spending years teaching them to die for it? For Japan, the answer came slowly, through schools, cinema, and memory. The Betty became a symbol of collective grief rather than glory. In textbooks, its photograph was captioned not as a victor of early battles, but as a lesson in the cost of blind obedience. For engineers worldwide, it was proof that a machine could be flawless and still be wrong. Voices from the other side. Decades later, Allied veterans who had faced the Betty spoke with unexpected respect. Marine pilot Jack Luker said in a 1972 interview, "We called them easy kills, but no one felt good about it. You saw that flash and you knew 7 men were gone. They kept coming anyway. You have to admire that, even as you pull the trigger." Their words added a final layer to the Betty's legacy, respect for courage tainted by futility.